doves. That was wonderful. We're now in the 9th week of our series on the Bible, the year of the Bible, and we're coordinating this with our disciple reading, and we are now at the place where we're talking about the prophets. And so we're going to be reading from one of the classic prophets of all time, Amos. And I'll be reading Amos chapter 5, verses 18 through 24. If you're able, I would invite you to stand. Alas for you who desire the day of the Lord. Why do you want the day of the Lord? It is darkness, not light. As if someone fled from a lion and was met by a bear, or went into the house and rested a hand against the wall and was bitten by a snake. Is not the day of the Lord darkness? Not light, and gloom. No brightness in it. And in this next section, the prophet now takes on the voice of God. I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not accept them. The offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like the waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. The word of the Lord. You may be seated. Well, there once was a farmer who was buying a new car, and he saw an advertisement from one of the dealers claiming that they had the lowest bottom line in town and a free gift to boot. Well, the farmer was really excited when he discovered that the free gift was a very nice color TV, but he wasn't so excited when he got the invoice for the purchase of the car. In addition to the base price of the car, the dealer had added all sorts of other items. Perhaps you've been through this experience with car dealers. Things like rust proofing, $300, fabric guard, $250, dealer advertising fees, $100, and so on and so forth. And thus, the dealer's bottom line was far from the lowest bottom line in town. Now, this really angered the farmer, and so when the same car dealer came to his farm to purchase a cow for his small ranch, he gave him the following bill. Basic cow, $200. Two-tone exterior, $45. Extra stomach, $75. Product storage compartment, $60. 4 dispensing devices at $10 each. Genuine cowhide upholstery, $125. Automatic fly swatter, $35. The bottom line, $510. What's the bottom line in the Christian faith? When we boil away all of the superficialities, what remains? That is really the question that the prophet Amos is wrestling with in chapter 5 of his book. The prophet Amos, you see, was a bottom line kind of a guy. He wasn't like Ezekiel, who was a priest, or a government bureaucrat like Daniel, or a king like David. No, Amos was just a shepherd and a farmer from a small town about 10 miles south of Jerusalem. Amos was a businessman, and judging by the quality of his writings and his knowledge of international affairs, he was a very accomplished businessman. Now, there were lots of successful businessmen in the northern kingdom of Israel, where Amos prophesied in the 8th century BC, because it was a time of tremendous prosperity in the history of Israel. But the problem was, it was only a time of prosperity for a certain group of people. Like our day, the rich were getting richer while the poor were getting poorer. because the well-to-do landowners were seizing the poor people's small plots of land, making serfs of them, and then selling them into slavery. Oppression and corruptions were everywhere during Amos's day. And yet, the religious life of the community was thriving. There were sacrifices, hundreds and hundreds of sacrifices every single day, because the people believed that the bottom line of religion was who was going to get into heaven and who wasn't going to get into heaven, basically. And you can pretty well figure out where they saw themselves in that little equation. They began to believe, the Israelites did, that their status as God's chosen people made them better than all of the other people around them. God was on their side, so they thought, and God was against all of their uneducated, unenlightened neighbors. And so many of the people in Amos's day began to long for what they called the day of the Lord, which was going to be a day of judgment in which God was going to come into the scene in a powerful way and was going to condemn all of Israel's enemies and punish them. But Amos warns them to beware of what they wish for. The day of the Lord, he says in 5:18, will be like a day of darkness, not a day of light. It will be like a person who's running from a lion only to be met by a bear. It'll be like you're leaning your head up against a building and all of a sudden you're bitten by a cobra. It will be out of the fire and into the frying pan, says Amos, because the hammer of God's judgment will fall especially hard, not on Israel's ignorant neighbors, but rather on enlightened Israel, who has God's law, but is not obeying it at all. Now, this would certainly be a word of warning for you and me also. Every country, and the United States in particular, more than most probably, tends to think of itself as God's chosen nation and is inherently blind to its own faults. And so God sends prophets in order to try to bring the people back, in order to speak hard words of truth to the society. The prophets. Oh, yes. Now, if there ever was an eccentric group of people on the planet, it is and was the prophets. The prophets would do almost anything to get the people's attention and to wake them up to God's truth. Consider Isaiah, who stripped off all of his clothes and wandered around naked. Or Jeremiah, who not only hid his underwear under a rock for a period of time, but then went back to retrieve it after what the text calls a, quote, really long time. I don't know about you, but I don't think I want to hang around for that object lesson. That doesn't sound good. And then there was Hosea, who married a prostitute and named her Lo Harim, which means unloved in Hebrew. That poor child. At the very least, we would say that the prophets were a couple fries short of a Happy Meal, or that they just could use probably some good therapy. And yet, as Jeremiah the prophet says about himself, he says, the prophets have a burning in their bones to communicate the message of justice that God has given to them, no matter how much resistance there was to the message. And there usually was resistance, because the prophets were almost out of sync with the society around them. When everything in society was coming up roses, when the GNP was up and everybody was happy, for instance, the prophets almost came with a word of gloom and doom for the people, a word of judgment. But on the other hand, when everybody in society was just terrible, when all economic indicators were down, when the people were full of despair, and when the enemy was outside of the gate, it was the prophet who had a word of hope for the people. So woe be to us if we ignore the voice of the prophet. We need the prophet because he or she shows us new ways of seeing, ways, if the prophet proves true over time, ways that are of God. I remember growing up as a young person. Then it did happen. It was a long time ago. The dinosaurs were roaming Earth. But I remember having arguments, or not arguments, but at least listening to my father rail against environmentalists and people like Ralph Nader. Oh, he did not like Ralph Nader. He thought Ralph Nader was really, really bad. He was a troublemaker, he said. And yet, you know, looking back, right, Ralph Nader was right about a lot of things. For instance, a lot of the safety car legislation that he got passed was really good stuff. He saved hundreds, probably thousands of people's lives with innovations like safety belts that we all now take for granted. Even though he took a lot of flack for it at the time. We need the prophet. We need the prophet, friends. We need to be open to what they are saying about our world today, about American foreign policy, about our domestic policy, and about how the church is interacting with society. Now, we certainly don't have to agree with everything a prophet, quote-unquote, says, because prophets have to be tested against the Bible, and I think time will prove true most prophets, or not true. But we do need to listen to the prophets and weigh what they are saying carefully, rather than simply dismissing them outright as unpatriotic or un-American. And let's not kid ourselves that somehow we in the church are going to be exempt from the prophet's words of judgment simply because we come to church and worship God rightly. Many people in Amos's time, for instance, felt that proper worship, ritual sacrifices, and solemn assemblies was the bottom line of religion. That was what was important. Being orthodox, being right, coming to church, that was the important thing they thought. And yet Amos tells them that God was not impressed with their religiousness. I despise your festivals, we read in verse 24, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, or guitars, or organs, or pianos, or whatever. Now, the point here isn't that worship isn't important, just as the issue of who's going to make it to heaven and who isn't irrelevant either. But rather, the point is that worship that isn't matched by a life of holiness is a fraud, and people will see right through it. So the question is, what is the bottom line of our faith? If it isn't who's going to get into heaven or proper worship, Amos lays it out in verse 24. Let justice roll down like the waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Justice, powerful and cleansing like an ever-flowing stream, is the bottom line, my friends. If our lives don't reflect the justice of God, then our faith is a sham, because people don't care how much we know until they know how much we care. Our word has no meaning, there's no backing behind it, if we don't put acts of justice behind them. How much do we care? Let's put that question into perspective by imagining that we could shrink the population of planet Earth to 100 people. Maybe you've seen this passing around on the internet. If we did that, here's what the village of 100 people would look like. There would be 57 Asians, 21 Europeans, 14 of them, 14 from the Western Hemisphere, and 8 from Africa. Agnes, I'm glad to see that you're here this morning to represent that. That's great. 70 would be non-white, 30 would be white. 70 would be non-Christian, 30 would be Christian. 80 would live in substandard housing. 70 would be unable to read. 50, half of the world of that global village would be suffering And get this, 50% of the entire world's wealth would be in the hands of 6 people. Can't do that with one tablet. 6 people. 6 people, and all of them would be Americans. Only one would have a college education. And statistically speaking, nobody would have a personal computer. That's pretty mind-blowing, isn't it? We are so blessed to live here in this country. To be poor, even in the United States, is to be rich from a global perspective. And it is how you and I respond to those other people, those folks that have so much less than we do, that will largely reveal our devotion to God, according to Amos. Not our Bible knowledge or how wonderful our worship services are, as important as those things are, and they are. Now, Jesus, of course, said the same thing in Matthew chapter 25, didn't he? With the parable of the sheep and the goats, right? This is a bottom line kind of a story that Jesus told. He said the only difference between the 2 groups of people, the ones who are going to come into his presence and the ones who are going to be cast away from his presence, is the way that they treated who? The hungry, right? And the stranger, the sick, and the naked, those in prison. It was their actions towards the least of these, right? That was the bottom line. In other words, talk is cheap, but the bottom line is revealed by our actions. So what's your bottom line? What's your bottom line? Justice, according to the Bible, is not a static concept. See, in our culture, when we think of justice, we probably think of Lady Justice, right? The woman with the blindfold holding the scales of justice, and all things are in balance. All things are fair, and all things are equal. That is the Western concept of justice. And yet, the image that Amos calls to mind is totally different, isn't it? Justice, he says, isn't like a perfectly balanced situation. Justice, he says, is like a surging, powerful stream. All is motion and commotion, not static and fairness. Nothing is at rest, according to Amos's picture of justice. To the Bible, justice is a verb. To you and I in Western culture, it's more of a noun. But the Bible says justice is something we must do, not a state somehow that we achieve. And so the prophet Micah says, what does the Lord require of you but to do what? To do justice and to walk humbly with your God and to love kindness. Justice is something we do. It's a verb. So let me ask you, let me ask myself, what are you doing for justice? Now, there's 1,000 ways that we can do justice, aren't there? And nobody's plan is going to be the same. That's the great thing. Nobody's plan has to be the same plan. We can't all do everything, and so many of these sermons about justice, right, are so overwhelming that all we do is leave feeling guilty. Don't try to do everything. We can't all do everything, but we can all do something. I don't care what your station in life is. You can do something for justice. Our mission committee is trying so hard, is doing a great job of creating opportunities for our congregation to do justice. And we all don't have to do everything, but again, we all should try and do something. It's like a menu. You pick and choose what fits you with your life. With the giving tree in the back, once a quarter, we're changing it. This year it goes to Friday Friends, to kids who don't have food over the weekend. We have the food pantry garden to help low-income families, seniors. And I mentioned it before, and I'm going to mention it again, and I'm probably going to keep mentioning it for quite a while. The alternative gift market on Saturday, November 22nd from 11 o'clock till 2 o'clock, where you will be able to do justice by giving gifts from over a dozen local organizations and 30 international projects. We have a dream that someday St. Paul Presbyterian Church will be as well known, not only in Johnston, but in fact throughout all of Des Moines, as the church that sponsors the alternative gift market. We want that to be as well known as the fall, or the community, rather, harvest dinner. Community harvest dinner is great. Wouldn't it be awesome if we also became known as the church that put Christ back in Christmas by enabling people to give just gifts that did good in the world and that made the giver feel absolutely fantastic because they weren't wasting their money on something that somebody doesn't really need, honestly? Wouldn't that be awesome? When people thought about St. Paul, if they said, oh, that's the church that does the alternative gift market that hundreds and thousands of people come to. Now, it's going to take us a while to get there. But that's what we want to be known as. That church, that mission center, that mission outpost that does that good deed for all of Des Moines. There's almost nobody that does anything like that in the Des Moines area that I can tell. Yesterday, I was deeply moved during Merge service when Steve Hansen was talking about one time when he asked Merge why it was that he was involved in so many different activities, both in the community and in the church. Because Steve said, I never really felt that much of a compulsion to go do as many things as my dad did. He said that Mert thought about it a little bit when Steve asked him that question. And then he said, you know, when I got back from World War II, I asked God why it was that I had been spared, that I survived, that God saved me when so many of my friends didn't come back from the war. And Mert said that he never quite felt that God fully answered that question for him. But he figured that he better do something with his life to say thanks. I love that. Doing justice, friends, is one of the ways, maybe the primary way, that we say thank you to God for saving us. Because each of us has been saved by Jesus Christ, by His grace and by His mercy. We haven't done anything to deserve that. We haven't done anything to deserve living in this country, to be born with the parents that we have. It's all a gift. And it's the bottom line of our faith. Let's pray. Gracious God, help us to let justice roll down like the waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Lord, your justice comes from the heavens and is like that, but sometimes it gets blocked. It's like there's a beaver dam, and we're it. And God, the bells and the choirs and the nice buildings and the Bible studies are all great, and they're all really important stuff. We need those things. But help us to remember that nobody cares how much we know until they know how much we care. God, help us to hear the words of the prophets, both the ancient ones and the modern ones. And hearing, help us to do justice. This we pray in Jesus' name. We're going to stand, and we're going to sing number 434. Today we all are called to do